I think ultimately the only way to reach herd immunity, which is the idea really that if enough people are psychologically inoculated in the population so that some of these techniques no longer have any effect. I think that's only going to happen if this idea spreads interpersonally. So I think people underestimate their own role in the process of pre-bunking and information resilience. I think we all have the ability to help each other, and we don't just have to leave it to fact checkers. That's my message, that everyone can play an active role in helping each other spot manipulative information.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast that explores how recent discoveries in neuroscience are helping unravel the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 208. You can find complete show notes and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com, and you can send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. I also want to mention that the Brain Science mobile app is now called Brain Science Podcast. This app is available for all mobile devices and is a great way to access both free and My Lipson premium content. This month's episode is an interview with Xander van der Linden about his new book, Foolproof: Why Misinformation Infects Our Minds and How to Build Immunity. Dr. van der Linden is a professor of psychology at Cambridge University in the UK, and in recent years, he has been exploring how to help people resist false information and manipulation. Given that the spread of false information cost thousands of lives during the COVID pandemic, I feel that this topic is both timely and important. If you would like to get episode show notes automatically every month, just sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter, either at brainsciencepodcast.com or by texting Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. When you sign up, you get a free gift entitled 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. Brain Science relies on the financial support of listeners like you. You can learn more at brainsciencepodcast.com/premium. Be sure to keep listening after the interview because I will review the key ideas and share a few brief announcements. Xander, it is great to have you on Brain Science today.
Pleasure to be on the show.
So could you start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself, including where you're from and how you got interested in the psychology of misinformation?
Yeah, I grew up in the Netherlands originally, and then I moved to the States for college and postgraduate studies, and then I ended up here in England at Cambridge. I'm a professor of psychology. I was studying how people are influenced by information and what causes persuasion in general. And then a few years back, I started thinking about this idea of helping people resist persuasion, especially by false information and manipulation. And I started investigating the flip side, and I became really interested in this idea of whether you can actually inoculate people against misinformation and manipulation and disinformation and propaganda. So that's really at least where my interest came from as a social psychologist. I mean, as a social, I do a lot of cognitive research also on how people process information, but my interest has always also been in the underlying social processes that are involved in persuasion and why people come to believe things that aren't necessarily true. And so that's where I've started.
Great. Yeah, I haven't had that much opportunity to read about social psychology, but I have had Carol Tavris on the show a couple of times to talk about cognitive dissonance
Mm.
because especially, in recent years, we've had opportunities to see real life examples of that for sure. So, everyone that's listening to this podcast is probably aware of the destructive effects of misinformation, but how do you begin to tackle this topic with scientific rigor?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because everyone seems to have an idea of what's misinformation and what is not misinformation. And I think when you study this topic, you're a bit agnostic to I'm not so interested in playing the role of a fact checker. We're more interested in learning how people process information and why people think that certain information might be true or false or manipulative or accurate or reliable, whatever label you want to put on it. And that's, I think, how you study this topic, by not necessarily focusing like what a journalist would do on the truth value of a claim, but rather about the underlying psychological process. And that's where I think it gets interesting in how people come to believe things and what processes are involved in that and how the brain responds to information under different conditions. And of course, we bring the tools from experimental science to bear on these questions. So sometimes we do experiments on people and we expose them to information that's presumably false or scientific. Sometimes people do neurological, neuroscientific research also on this area, although there's not a whole lot of it. And we also use a lot of big data. So we look at what goes on social media and try to look at millions of data points and see what types of information get traction and why that might be. What is it about the psychological processes that make people susceptible to want to share content online, for example?
So, throughout your book, you use the term psychological immunity. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a philosopher at Carnegie Mellon University who refers to me as a cognitive immunologist, and he really advocates for this field of, or what he sees as should be a new field of cognitive immunology. And I think to me, really what he's saying is the study of mental defenses of the mind. And I think it's an interesting area. So when I say psychological immunity or mental immunity, what I mean is that there's actually an interesting analogy between how bodies become resistant to viruses via an immune response and how the mind can become resistant to manipulation via a similar type of immune response, but then on the psychological level. So, you might say that when the body is introduced to a weakened dose of a virus or an inactivated strain of a virus, it triggers the production of antibodies to then help confer resistance against future infection. And it turns out you can do the same with the mind, though, that if you introduce the mind to weakened doses of the types of manipulation they might see in the future, the mind can build up antibodies, cognitive antibodies, against future quote unquote infection with the misinformation, or at least the techniques that are used to spread misinformation. And I think it's interesting because the analogy runs pretty close in the sense that the more copies your body has of what an invading pathogen looks like, the better it is in neutralizing it, right? To be able to spot it and neutralize it. And it works the same with the brain, really. If we have no mental defenses of the types of fingerprints or cues or heuristics that we need to be looking for in terms of what's manipulative and what's not, people are easily duped. But once we build up that resistance, the brain can more easily spot it and neutralize it, and people are less likely to be influenced by it. And that's to me the idea of mental immunity. And we also use that in studying. We use models from public health, from epidemiology to study how information spreads in online networks. And you have a lot of the same phenomena. A lot of people are asymptomatic. They're just resharing false content, right? You can have the R naught for information pathogens. Depends on the infectiousness period, right? On you have a lot of the same variables. How long does it take for somebody to start posting information that's false? And then when they expose it to another node in the network, do they become activated and start spreading it? And you can calculate all of the same metrics. And so I think it's just a fascinating analogy.
It's just like the CDC, I think, has used the famous zombie apocalypse model for trying to help people understand how diseases spread. It's the same idea in the other
Yeah.
direction. So, one problem that has worried me for a long time is the fact that the more often people hear something that's false, the more likely they come to believe that it's true. If it sounds familiar, it seems true. And this really disturbs me because it makes me worry that if I attempt to debunk a false claim, and let's say here in neuroscience, there's a lot of those, I'm worried that if I try to debunk a false claim, that it's going to actually backfire. And what my listeners are going to remember is, the false claim. How do we overcome this? I think you called it the illusionary truth effect.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think there are at least two things that we're trying to battle in this regard. So people have a truth bias in the sense that we generally assume that most things are true because thinking about our regular environments, most people are not, or at least what used to be perhaps true, is most people are not constantly lying to us. And so it's a decent heuristic to assume that given the amount of misinformation or the amount of information that we're regularly exposed to, we assume most of it is probably not completely false. And that seems to work relatively well in some environments. But then when you shift to environments where the baseline of misinformation is a lot higher, whether it's a political debate or social media, then when you apply those same heuristics, things don't pan out as well. And I think that people are struggling with this idea sometimes that we tend to browse the world. If we have to critically think about every piece of information, that's very exhausting. And so we just think that most things are true. And then this is all compounded by the illusory truth effect, or the idea that the more often you repeat something, the more likely people are to believe it or think that it's true, regardless of their prior knowledge on the subject, which is an important, I think, addendum to or addition to that finding, because people are not accessing relevant knowledge when this problem occurs. And so, even though they might have it, it's not actively retrieved. And so, one example that I often give people when I illustrate this, I will often say Madrid is one of the most. It's in fact the biggest city in Spain. It's a very populous city. It's the most populous city in Europe, and not every American is familiar with the population statistics of all of the cities in Europe. So I will say, well,
I suspect that's false.
it's the most populous city in Europe because the UK has left is not in London, so now it's the most populous city. But in fact, it still isn't. But the more I repeat it, now every time people hear Madrid, they're going to think, oh, yeah, that's one of the bigger cities in Europe. I mean, it is, but it is not the most populous city in Europe. And so unfortunately, the more you create that association for people, regardless of whether we've now said that that's incorrect, they're still going to be primed to think, okay, what do I know about Madrid? Oh, yeah, it's one of the most populous cities in Europe. And I just keep repeating it now. But it's the same idea with really if I told you, oh, I was I was eating at a restaurant on your street the other week and I got this terrible food poisoning. It was just terrible. And then a week later, I tell you, oh, actually, it was not that restaurant, it was some other restaurant. But now every time you're going to pass that restaurant, you're going to think food poisoning. And I think that's the problem with the illusory truth effect. And it really occurs because the brain mistakes fluency for truth. And so the more you repeat something, the more familiar it becomes. And technically, we call that fluency, or the ease with which something is processed. And you can create fluency effects with lots of things. If you print something in bold, it's easier for the brain to read. You can do it faster than if it's not bolded. And so there are a lot of these different ways of enhancing the fluency with which we can process information. And the brain just thinks that something that you can process faster is more likely to be true. And so that's where it goes wrong. In some situations, that makes sense. We all know that 2 plus 2 is 4, and we don't have to think about it. It's fast, it's fluent. But unfortunately, that can leverage that same mechanism for the purposes of misinformation. And in fact, if you look at some interesting neuroscientific research on that, the mechanism isn't entirely clear. And this relates also to your point about debunking. What happens when you debunk something is that people often continue to retrieve false details from memory, even when they acknowledge having seen a correction. And this is what we call the continued influence of misinformation. And that's in the book, I talk about the viral analogy that, like a virus, it lingers. And it's very difficult to eradicate. And I think the reason we're not entirely sure. So there's two kind of competing models. The first is what we call a failure to retrieve debunk or the correction. And this kind of happens when people are exposed to a debunk, but then they actually fail to retrieve it during activation. So they're accessing the myth, but they're failing to retrieve the correction in an appropriate way. And the other account has to do with a failure to integrate. So people fail to integrate the correction in their mental model of how something works. The misinformation nerds are super interested in which account is more likely. I think we see both occurring. And so in a typical experiment is they put people in a scanner and then they gave them some story about an fMRI scanner and then some story about a plane crash happening. And then there was the origin of the plane crash was revealed in a treatment group. And then they later debunk that in the experiment. So they say, oh, actually, that wasn't the cause of the plane crash. And then they compare that to the control group. And they do see some differential activation that they then try to link to the idea that either there's a memory retrieval error occurring or there's a failure to integrate. But it's very hard to disentangle these processes, especially because they can also co occur. I think for me, the key takeaway is, and maybe this is the most practical thing for listeners, is that basically the correction and the misinformation are competing for space. People are activating them concurrently in their memory. And so there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. Either people fail to retrieve it correctly or they don't integrate it correctly. And there's probably other problems we haven't even identified yet that can go wrong during that process. And for that reason, debunking is often not fully effective. There are evidence based ways to debunk. And even if you do it in the best way possible, it might still linger. But I think the practical takeaway is that you need to make the correction as prominent as possible. And the misinformation, try not to repeat it. Sometimes you have to, but do it once and not very prominently, because it's all about the ratio of how often people hear the correction versus the misinformation. And the more prominent the correction is, the less likely you are to make a retrieval or integration error. And that's the science behind it. Yeah.
So that's the idea behind the model of the truth sandwich. You mentioned the true thing first. In the middle, maybe you have a little teeny reference to the myth. And then at the end, you again emphasize the accurate thing.
Exactly. And to help people do foolproof way of debunking, that's really what it's about, is to use the truth sandwich, exactly as you said, where you start with the truth. Then, if you have to, you mention the falsehood or the misinformation once, briefly, and explain why it's misleading. And then again, you layer it with the truth on top. And then you've made a truth sandwich that's supposed to help with insulating the misinformation with the truth so that people don't end up misremembering things. The danger that you mentioned earlier on is that what happens is that you repeat the misinformation too often and it ends up strengthening the existing associations people have with the myth in their memory, and people forget about the correction because it's more difficult to integrate or to process. And so you're just reactivating old links that the myth has already created. And as you know, memory is a network, right? And so the more nodes and the more linkages are activated, the stronger they become. And that's really the problem, that you end up playing a game of whack-a-mole, that it's already made new links and new friends in your memory. And so when you come around a few years later saying this isn't true, it's already a whole spider web of things that have evolved from there. I mean, I should say the truth sandwich is, we're trying to find the best ways to debunk something, and the science on that isn't settled. But I think the general consensus is that the truth sandwich is kind of a foolproof, a safe way of doing things.
So one of the things, Xander, that I really appreciated about your book was the discussion about why conspiracy theories seem to be mushrooming out of control. It doesn't really matter whether a person thinks that the moon landing was a hoax, but the conspiracy theories that were spawned against the COVID vaccine is literally costing people their lives. So, will you take us through what makes people susceptible to conspiracy theories? I guess that's its own particular flavor of misinformation, isn't it?
It is. It's a very specific form of misinformation, and often it's conflated in the news. But psychologically, it's actually much more influential, I would say. People who believe in conspiracy theories often have a whole worldview that revolves around being suspicious of official narratives. It's very different from some regular individual just being duped by false claim. Conspiracy theories, people who endorse them often endorse multiple at the same time, which is why we call it a monological belief system. And so the probability that you endorse a conspiracy theory goes up very quickly as a function of the number of conspiracies that you endorse. So if you endorse one, the probability that you'll endorse two goes up. And if you endorse multiple, the probability that you have a whole list increases quite steeply. And so it's kind of a self sustaining worldview, because there's also the justification that the belief in the other conspiracies is justified by belief in another conspiracy. So it becomes almost a cult like worldview that's very difficult to penetrate. I often liken it to a multi level marketing scheme. So it's very difficult to get out of that. Now, psychologically, there are a few different motives. There's a profile in terms of, if you're thinking personality or something like that, there's a profile of people who are more susceptible. It tends to be people who feel marginalized, who have deep distrust of officialdom, including official institutions, government, mainstream media. People, not always, but people who are lower on analytical numeracy, literacy, educational skills, and then people who are slightly more paranoid or neurotic. And so there are these general tendencies that can increase people's risk factors. Already engaging with pseudoscience is a huge gateway, for example. But at a broader level, I think there's three psychological motives that are really fulfilling for people. And that's, I think, why they're so psychologically attractive in general. And the first is what we call epistemological, or kind of the the need for knowledge. And so conspiracy theories offer these wonderfully causal explanations for things that aren't really connected, but they draw really enticing connections between things. Oh, why are there more COVID deaths around 5G networks? That can't be a coincidence. So one must be causing the other. And so 5G is exacerbating the outbreak. Or there's a third variable that explains both: population density, right? There's more phone mass and more deaths where there's more people. But that's left out of the story. And they're trying to create connections. And there's great research on this showing that illusory pattern perception increases belief in conspiracy theories. So the brain that wants to make connections and wants to see patterns, and so conspiracy theories really play into that tendency. And of course, people want to be in the know. It feels good to not be among the sheeple and to be the only one who knows the truth. And so that's the epistemological motive. The second is a social or relational motive. So a lot of people feel, and I think this is an underappreciated one, a lot of people feel marginalized. They have low agency. They feel out of control. They don't feel like they have control over what's happening in the world. And they want a simple narrative that gives them control and tells them what to do and what's real and what's not. It's much easier to think that school shootings don't happen, that they're all crisis actors. Global warming isn't happening, that COVID isn't real. It's much safer to live in a world where none of that is happening. And it gives you an opportunity to connect with like minded individuals. So it gives a sense of community, a sense of belonging. People who feel isolated, who've been adversely affected by the pandemic, might feel that there are now online communities of people that share their concerns and that are suspicious and have alternative viewpoints. And so it's really a strong sense of connection that people can forge. And the last is existential, and that has to do with uncertainty and threat. And so most conspiracy theories have some function of trying to alleviate feelings of uncertainty and threat about the future. Again, whether it's pandemics or climate or other science related problems where people would otherwise have to sacrifice something or think about consequences that are not so pleasant. And we know that there's this thing in psychology called terror management. And so people try to manage worries about fear and anxiety, and conspiracy theories are one way to manage it. So, yeah, those are three broad motives.
Where does your conspire mnemonic come in?
Yeah, so the conspire mnemonic is to help people identify the seven fingerprints or the seven signs of conspiratorial thinking. And so we've deduced years of research into conspiracy theories into helping people identify them. I think the number one mistake that people make is trying to argue over a specific conspiracy theory because it's so difficult. People won't let go of their belief system. I think it's much easier, and this is what we found, to help people identify the underlying building blocks of any conspiracy theory. And so the conspire are the building blocks. And in some fun experiments, we've actually asked Americans, in this is an experiment we did in Georgia, I think, to come up with their own conspiracy theory out of nowhere. And then we look to see if people indeed use these building blocks. And that's what we find. We created them by analyzing existing conspiracy theories and seeing what ingredients go into them. And then we identified this list. And then we had people build them from scratch, not knowing what the ingredients are, but intuitively they seem to be using most of them. And so I'll quickly run through them. The conspire acronym: C stands for incoherence. So most conspiracy theories are entirely incoherent logically. So the one about Osama bin Laden, either he was already dead when the troops arrived or he's still alive somewhere. Doesn't matter. These are two mutually exclusive conspiracy theories, but if you ask people, they endorse them both at the same time with equal fervor. Princess Diana, is she still alive somewhere? Tupac Shakur. All of these conspiracies have the same sort of answer, that either their death was a cover up or they're still alive somewhere. And so there's this sort of basic incoherence. COVID is another example. I'm not sure if people on this podcast have seen Plandemic, the conspiracy movie. The explanation that is advanced is that COVID is a hoax. That's one of them. But then the other one is that wearing the mask already activates the existing COVID that you have from previous vaccinations. And so, again, these are two totally different conspiracies, but people will endorse both of them at the same time. So most of them are incoherent. Then O stands for overriding suspicion. Most conspiracy theories have an overriding suspicion of mainstream narrative. So if something is overly suspicious, it's probably a conspiracy theory. N stands for nefarious intent. It's one of my favorites. This is, I think, a good sign. There's always some nefarious actor or group of actors plotting in secret. That's the whole idea behind a conspiracy theory. And there aren't any positive conspiracy theories. It's never like your friends were plotting in secret to throw you a surprise birthday party. That isn't one of the ones they're floating. And so it's always some bad group of people, right? That's a hint. And then the S stands for something must be wrong. That's another key sign that they don't know exactly what, but something is not right. Something's not adding up. That's like a key part of construing a conspiracy theory. And then the P stands for persecuted victim. There are always some group of people who are the victim of the conspiracy. And so if there's a nefarious intent, then there tends to be persecuted a victim. So I talk about Alan in the book, and Alan emailed me about Shakespeare and how he discovered that Shakespeare didn't write his own sonnets. And if you read his works from back to front, then hidden patterns are revealed, which leads you to conclude that I think it's what was it, the Earl of Oxford really wrote the sonnets or something like that. But I think the key point is that there are victims here. So people outside of academia who are not being heard, and academia is silencing alternative accounts of the Shakespeare sonnets, and it's a whole conspiracy. And then I stand for immunity to evidence. So there's no updating. There's this wonderful documentary on Netflix. I think it's called Behind the Curve. It's about flat Earth. And they actually have a gyroscope and do the test of what's happening. And the test disconfirms their theory. And so their reaction was like, wow, we're really surprised by this. There must be something wrong with this equipment. Yeah. And they say there's something wrong with the scientific method because we weren't expecting this result. They're completely immune to evidence. It doesn't matter what you say. Either you're part of the conspiracy or the method is flawed. It's completely immune to updating about evidence. And then the last one is reinterpreting randomness. We talked about the 5G example where two random events are reinterpreted to suddenly have a connection. So that's conspire. Fun thing we sometimes do is you can throw any conspiracy at us. We can tease them out with these 5 building blocks. So one crazy one I talk about in the book is Wayfair, the furniture company, got sucked into this conspiracy about that they were trafficking young girls in their furniture because the prices seemed ridiculously high to someone on Twitter of their furniture. And so they started Googling the barcodes of the furniture in a Russian search engine, and then pictures of missing girls came up, and then they became part of this pedophile conspiracy ring. It was a whole thing. And of course, this was all hocus pocus. But I think the interesting thing here is that there's the persecuted victim, right? These are the young girls in the scenario. Then there's the something must be wrong because the prices are too high. Nefarious intent, it's the evil company that's selling the dubious furniture. You can use all of these building blocks and tease out any conspiracy theory.
So, Sandra, why does misinformation spread so much faster than the facts?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been some interesting research on this and some rare research because, a lot of social media data is not publicly available. And so one study that kind of looked at the full Twitter archives, which is relatively rare. So, every tweet since the inception of Twitter. And one of the things they found was that misinformation spread further, faster, and deeper in all categories, politics, science, than true information, or at least fact checked information that was part of the study. And they did this by looking at what people posted and the replies they posted with links to fact checked articles. And then looked at how rumors spread on Twitter and how the fact checks spread. They basically concluded that the rumor, on average, it took about 6 times as long for the truth to reach people than a falsehood to reach, let's say, 1,500 people. I think that was the metric they used. The old saying that a lie can make its way halfway around the world before the truth even has a chance to put its pants on or shoes on. It's funny because the history of that quote is a bit dubious. It's Jonathan Swift, Churchill, Twain.
Somebody said it.
Somebody said some form of it. In the States, it's, I think, before the truth has had a chance to put its pants on. In the UK, it's shoes on. It's interesting. But I think it illustrates the idea that falsehoods fly and the truth comes limping afterwards. That was the original version by Jonathan Swift, I think. And that's what the study illustrated. And now this is not always true on every social media platform for every issue, but it does happen, and I think it's problematic. And the reasons for that are partly because misinformation tends to be more novel. It tends to use more emotional language, more moral language. It tends to be more provocative. And so it has this sort of X factor that makes people more likely to want to share it. Some people, there's this interesting if true effect. So even if people don't believe it, they might say, this would be interesting if it were true. So I'm going to share it. Anything that kind of sounds provocative and novel gets more traction, whereas a lot of the fact checks are just not exciting. And so science doesn't travel as fast. And yeah, with some other research too, where they looked at anti-vaccination groups on Facebook and the growth of those versus pro-science sort of pages. And one of the things I found was that the anti-vax pages, they were entangled in lots of other topics, pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, alternative medicine. They were reaching on all sorts of webs, whereas science was just its own echo chamber. It had fewer outgoing links. It was just science linking to other science pages. It wasn't spreading as fast because it doesn't have sometimes what we call these weak ties, which they can cut across different topics or different audiences. And so misinformation seems to be interlinked with much more stuff, and that gives it more traction.
Yeah, I was very disturbed by the comment in your book that if the trend continued in 10 years, the anti vaxxers would have taken over Facebook. Sometimes it feels like they already have, but
Yeah, it depends on where you find yourself on Facebook. That's right. But yeah, their model, which of course was a simulation, but they projected that without proper intervention, if that growth rate continues, they would be dominating Facebook. And the trends we're seeing now on Twitter, and a lot of people are leaving, a lot of science people are leaving these platforms, and so that's not a good trend.
so there's always been misinformation, but why has it become, to stick with your infectious disease analogy, a pandemic?
Yeah, I think it partly has to do with how misinformation spreads. People say there's always been misinformation, and that's, of course, completely true. But I think there are radical new ways in which information and misinformation can be amplified. And we've talked a little about the spread, but it's also about the mode of delivery. So if you think about other social media channels like WhatsApp, you get information from what seem to be trusted in group members, friends, family. And so people are more likely to think that information is credible because it comes from people you know. I mean, lots of misinformation is shared in my WhatsApp groups. I had this guy called Dr. Imke advising that you basically blow hot air up your nose and that will kill the virus 3 times a day. And if you don't have the virus yet, then maybe 5 times for preventative purposes. But he was showing all kinds of scientific papers. And I suppose to the layperson, it can all sound quite confusing. I think the issue is that there are so many different platforms. It's becoming highly fragmented now. Some people are on Rumble, Telegram, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat. On TikTok, you can go viral without having any followers. And so the algorithm just prioritizes what causes engagement. So you can reach millions of people and not even have any followers. So I think the system and the game has completely rewired the flow of information in society, which is causing a unprecedented spread of all kinds of information, and some of it clearly false and manipulative. People are not used to that. And it's also coming at us from so many different sources, right? It's not just Twitter or Facebook, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's the internet, it's cable news, it's podcasts. I was just talking about Spotify to someone the other day about Joe Rogan and how people deal with misinformation being spread on via audio channels like podcasts. I bring that up because we were talking about it now. So it's on a podcast, right? And so it's interesting, all of these new ways in which people are consuming and producing information. It all comes together. And we talk a lot about online stuff, but it's also offline, right? Cable news, and there are a lot of streaming shows and friends and family that people talk to. And so quantifying exposure to misinformation has become vastly more complex because people have so many more channels through which information is reaching them. And that also means that it's much more difficult to try to mitigate it because you can try to talk to someone, but they're on 5 different apps on their phone and then on their computer and then offline and then at work. So it's different. In the book, I even go through some calculations of how long it took the Romans to spread a message versus how quickly it goes on WhatsApp, and try to show the exponential growth in the numbers. That if you forward a message on WhatsApp and the limit is up to 100 people in 20 groups, you're up to 5,000, and before you know it, you're up to millions. And so that just wasn't possible in the past. And sure, there's some potent examples. I talk about World War II propaganda in the book, and all people had really was sitting by the radio at that time and listening to false information on the radio. And I often ask, what if Hitler had access to social media? Would that have made his campaign even more efficient? It's kind of scary to think about that.
So I guess that's why you're taking this immunological approach, because it's not going away. Our best defense is trying to figure out how to immunize people against it, at least to a certain extent. That's the philosophy you're taking.
Yeah, the best defense is offense. People want to use the football metaphor. I think it does work that way. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I can come up with lots of different ways to make the point, but in the book, I like to use the vaccine analogy that prevention is just so much better. And even though we're not going to vaccinate everyone and it's going to be difficult, I think if we start with pre-bunking, then there are more opportunities for fact checking and debunking to be effective because less is getting through. People have already been primed. And I think it will just help filter out much more stuff if we create a good first line of defense. And that's why I'm interested in scaling this idea of pre bunking And even in the book, extending it to the idea of herd immunity. That's, of course, the ultimate kind of more social goal. And I think the nice thing about pre-bunking or inoculation is also that there are different ways of doing it. Take the United States, for example, the topic of misinformation is so politicized, but there are ways of implementing this in educational curricula in schools without making it political. And so we don't have to talk about vaccines or climate or immigration or abortion or any of these topics. We can pre-bunk the general techniques that are used to produce misinformation, whether it's false dichotomies, scapegoating groups of people, polarizing, the use of emotions, impersonating fake experts. And some of our treatments, in some of our videos, I use Star Wars as an example. That's the weakened dose in the treatment. It's an example of a false dilemma. So false dilemmas are huge on YouTube, for example, and also in political debates and in misinformation more generally. But we often get these statements like, "Oh, either join ISIS or you're not a good Muslim," or "We can't fix our homelessness problem if we let all the immigrants in," and so on. And so these are false dichotomies, right? And so people often don't catch on to that the first time they hear it. It's often, okay, I guess so. But when you think about it more, it's wait, there's more options than that. And so it's a particular way of presenting information in a misleading way. But you don't have to talk about any of these issues. You could simply give people a clip of Star Wars. And so you have Anakin Skywalker talk to Obi-Wan Kenobi, who says in Revenge of the Sith, if people are familiar with the Star Wars movie, either you're with me or you're my enemy, right? And then Obi-Wan replies and says, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And then the narrator explains what's a false dichotomy, how is it constructed, how do people use it? And then we test people with real misinformation. We find people can then identify this technique. You can actually get this, maybe some bipartisan support for the idea that since Aristotle's time, 2000 years ago, we have agreed upon definitions of what techniques are misleading, and it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. I think we can all agree that there are some techniques that are used to manipulate people and that it's beneficial to pre-bunk those so that when people come across misinformation, they can make up their own mind about that piece of information. Maybe some people say, oh, yeah, that's a misleading technique, but I'm going to believe it anyway. Well, fine. But at least then they're empowered to make that decision rather than being duped without their awareness.
Would you talk a little bit about micro targeting and why you called in your book, you call this a psychological weapon of mass persuasion?
Micro targeting is a really interesting topic. So I talk about the famous Cambridge sort of Analytica case, which is the most famous example of I guess, private Facebook data being harvested and then sold to a political company for the purposes of micro targeting people, which is really targeting ads based on people's digital footprint. So we all leave digital footprints behind on social media. When you click on something, when you like a page, that's a data point that goes into a matrix. And research has shown that those likes are actually really predictive of your sexuality, your gender, your age, your political preference, your personality. It does differ for different sorts of traits. And the more likes you can get, the more predictive it is. And some of this is not perhaps surprising. If you've liked pages named Barack Obama, then the prediction that you're likely to be a Democrat is not that impressive. But for some, it's actually really difficult. Personality is a complex psychological construct, and so they need more likes. But if they get, let's say, 100, 200 likes, they can predict your personality, whether you're extroverted or introverted, with a decent amount of accuracy. And benchmarking this against asking your friends or your family, they can even outperform your spouse if they can get enough likes. That has really troubled people in terms of what's happening. It's not just the things you like on Facebook, it's the groups you're a part of, the magazine subscriptions you get, the purchases you make online, the recommendations you get from Amazon, Alexa, all of the devices that, your search history, it all goes into the mix. And the more data about you that's available, the easier it is to micro target you. And the question is, well, is micro targeting a bad thing? Maybe for book recommendations, it isn't, although I wish the algorithm was more accurate in my case. But sometimes it is. There's a new study actually that showed that Amazon is recommending anti-vax books to people unprompted sometimes. And then when you search out for one or you click on one, then the algorithm starts to recommend it to you. And so that's something I was not even aware of, which is hugely, but makes sense because it's the same type of algorithm that other social media platforms use to drive engagement. So if that's what's driving engagement, that is where it gets problematic. But of course, the real objection is to use it for political purposes during elections. That's really what got people worked up, is that without people's awareness that they're being targeted with political ads to try to influence their vote. And that's really the most problematic use of micro targeting. Some platforms have now banned that, like Twitter. Although, I don't know, maybe Elon's going to bring it back. Who knows what he's doing? But on Facebook, you can still micro target people. And so the idea really is that you deliver an ad that is matched to someone's personality or their trait. For example, you can give people an ad that is a little bit more extroverted or one that's a little bit more introverted. And so they, in lab, quote unquote, lab experiments, you can do this in a controlled way with something innocent like a word puzzle. And then you show it to people in an introverted way. Or after a day of hard work, let's relax with a puzzle. Or somebody who is very extroverted, let's party and play. And you actually find that people do buy more products if the ads are micro targeted because they fit better with people's preferences. But if you can do that during elections about political candidates, that's very problematic if people don't know that they're being targeted. You can also do that with misleading information. You can show people ads with misleading information that you think is going to resonate with them. And if that ends up influencing their vote, of course, it's very concerning. And now we're actually at the stage of what we call nano targeting. So now they actually have models where they can identify not just groups of people based on their average trait, but they can identify single individuals and what makes them click on something. And they can drill it down to getting a single person to click on something. You do need a lot of data for this, but typically what they do in these political campaigns, they run 50,000 versions of the same ad. That's partly what the Trump campaign did, and perhaps also other campaigns. They run 50,000 versions of the same ad and they see what gets people to click. So, one of the things that I talk about in the book, even if they hadn't sold the personality data to a political firm that can use it to target people, right? Let's assume you don't have the personality data. Let's assume that, yeah, they stole it and they sold it, but it wasn't used. You don't need it. You can just run 50,000 ads and reverse engineer the process and let the algorithm find out what gets people going. And then once after 50,000 trials, the algorithm will find out what gets people to click. And then you can target people. And I think the big mistake that people make in this debate is that, sure, not everyone is influenced by ads, and we know that ads aren't always effective, but micro targeting vastly increases the efficiency of this process by making sure you don't target people with irrelevant information. So you're only getting the relevant information to people. So it optimizes the clicks on the ads. And two, elections are decided on small margins. You only need to find those people who are susceptible, open to persuasion, whether that's 1% of the population, 0.5% in a state. Think about swing states. You only need to get a small number of people persuaded with these ads. And so that's the part that worries me.
Could you talk a little bit about how the scientific study that you do is different from the research that's done by companies like Google?
I should say for the listeners, we do partner with companies like Google and Meta and also governments to try to evaluate these approaches. Partly because as a research lab, we're constrained. I mean, we've built simulated it took us years to build simulated social media engines. So we simulate Twitter because we don't have access to these platforms. So we have to build tools to try to simulate it. But ideally, to get these actors to adopt these approaches, they want to test it on their own platforms. They won't buy that you have a simulation and that it worked on the simulation, right? They say it's our company, our users, we know best. We want to try it on our platforms first. And so you have to work with them if you want to scale it and actually implement it. Some of that is hit or miss, but we've had a really good collaboration with Google's research arm, and I've been positive about the work that we've done with Google Jigsaw, which is formerly Google Ideas, the kind of the research incubator. They've really helped in ways that we couldn't have done on our own. And I have to admit that. So, one example is they allowed us to actually run these experiments on the YouTube platform live. During an ad campaign, people were exposed to pre-bunking videos. And then later in the ad space, they were confronted with misleading statements to see if actually on YouTube, when people are distracted, this approach actually works. And that allowed us to evaluate that actually the effects were smaller than when in a controlled environment, probably because people are distracted, right? But it still worked and that was positive, and that led them to roll the approach out further in more countries and more areas. And they're very slow, they're very risk averse. Misinformation is very politicized for them. It's been a difficult multi-year journey. Meta, Google, WhatsApp, they're rolling these things out now, and we've been working with them for years. I will say that the types of research they do is I've been impressed with Google because they seem really research oriented. They publish papers, but I think the biggest difference, the short answer to your question, is that they do a slightly different kind of research. They're on a much shorter timeline, so they don't have years to do experiments, right? It needs to happen now. They don't mind cutting a few corners. They can't ask detailed questions. They don't have validated psychological assessment instruments. They're on the platform. They have 30 seconds to ask people a quick question. That's how they do research, right? And sometimes they can ask more questions, but it's very limited in terms of what they can do and what they can ask. They don't significance testing, if people are familiar with that, doesn't happen on the same level of reliability. So we use what, 95%, 99%. In medicine, it's at least 99%, right? You can't just give people medicine if it wasn't tested with 99% confidence. In social science, we're happy to accept 95%, 5% error rate. But at these companies, they're happy with 80%, 90%, because they're moving fast and they don't have time. So 80% that this will show some effect. That's good for us. Let's do it. And so, they have different standards that are driven by a different model. They care about questions like, will people like us if we post this on their platform? Will people still trust us? And so one example is we come up with solutions that show objective efficacy. But then they will ask the question, but will people trust us less? Will they like this content? Will they engage with it? And I think both are useful, but sometimes we say we don't care if people don't like it. If it works, then we should implement it. I guess in a pessimistic way, you could say it could work, but if people don't engage with it, then your tool is going to see no traction and nobody's going to use it. And I think that's a fair counter argument. Insofar you can say, okay, something could work. We want people to do it. That's why we've developed games and animated videos because we know science can be boring for people, and we want to make it fun and entertaining. And so I think there is something to that point that you need people to actually want to engage with the tools you're developing. But I think the way they use engagement is slightly different. They want a solution that works and doesn't hurt engagement on their platform, right? Because more ads means more clicks, means more revenue. Sometimes we're asked, like, okay, this is interesting, but it seems to reduce engagement. Can you do it in a different way so that it still works but doesn't decrease engagement? And I think the truth of the matter is that sometimes that's just not possible. And it's a bit frustrating at times because sometimes maybe the best answer is to actually reduce engagement. If they were to change their incentives, if they're going to promote accuracy, constructive conversations, spreading less misinformation, yeah, maybe you get less clicks, less engagement, but maybe that would be better for the world. And in fact, there are surveys that show that people don't want to see that type, even though they click on it, they don't want to see that type of stuff on the platform. But some things are changing. Take Meta, for example. We're now debunking climate change misinformation on their platform. Years ago, they were like, "Oh, we don't want to be arbiters of truth. We don't want to get involved in any specific issues." But now, at least implicitly, they're taking the stance that we shouldn't be spreading misinformation about climate change on the platform, and they're trying to help with that. So I see that as a positive development. And maybe they will even say that, okay, if that pisses off some users and say, why is Meta concerned with climate change? I'm going to leave the platform, then so be it. And I think sometimes that's just the right approach. So there's some improvement sometimes, and then sometimes we take 10 steps backwards. I think Elon Musk fired all of the people who were working on pre-bunking at Twitter, the research people. So I think Twitter has just taken 10 steps back in terms of research collaborations. But then with other companies, we're moving forward a few steps. So it's difficult for me to keep track of the net progress here. I'm an optimist.
One of the problems that I have observed over the last 30 years is the so-called balanced coverage, where the news media gives equal time to both credible and non-credible sources, and they no longer seem to take any responsibility for fact checking. How does this false balance affect people's ability to recognize misinformation?
Yeah, I think false balance is a huge problem, and I think sometimes people underestimate things because when we talk about misinformation, sometimes people think flat Earth or the cloning celebrities, and this stuff isn't really that prevalent. That's a minor sort of part of the misinformation landscape. If you define things a bit broader to include things like false balance, I think then we're getting at a much bigger problem, which is that even the mainstream media sometimes will have contrarians or prop up contrarians just to balance out a conversation. So you have a doctor talking about vaccines, and then they need to have somebody who's experienced adverse effects share their story. And that gives people the idea that there's an even keel debate happening, or that it could be dangerous and it could be good, but it could also be dangerous. But what's happening there psychologically is problematic because you're pitting the voices of thousands of independent experts in trials against that of one or two anecdotes. And people stop making that differentiation because they're really being presented with just two voices that are given equal weight. And I think we've done a lot of research on this, on the psychology of consensus. And what we find is that people's mental model of science very much revolves around their perception of whether science agrees on something, like gravity is real, humans are causing global warming, vaccines, on average, when approved, are safe. And so, when the strategy that a lot of actors take is try to create doubt about consensus, whether it's between the link between smoking and cancer, fossil fuels and climate, or vaccines, and so on. And so it's a powerful strategy because it doesn't really convince people of alternative facts or misinformation. It's just casting doubt. And I think that's what a lot of the false balance debate and these norms in journalism are about. They're trying to undermine people's perception of consensus. And as I said, that's relevant because a lot of people's judgments about science and their willingness to adopt science based decisions are premised on this idea that scientists agree and they've done the work for us and they've on average decided that that's useful. And sure, consensus isn't everything, sure, that's fine, but I'm an expert on some topic. But if I go to make a medical decision, I'm going to rely on the experts or several experts and the consensus among them. I'm not going to investigate my own surgery ad nauseum and try to make that decision on my own without the voices of people who do this for a living, right? So we rely on expert consensus all the time, and it's a good heuristic that is undermined by false balance. And that's, I think, very problematic. And I think it's particularly problematic because it's bad actors who are doing that. But sometimes the mainstream media, I mean, the BBC's apologized for this, that they've propped up contrarians on climate for years, and they've stopped doing that now, finally. The tobacco industry, only in 2016 or 2017 were the court files finalized that determined that they had misled the public for decades on the link between smoking and cancer, and that they've been casting doubt on this link and that they need to run a corrective campaign. But as we know from our discussion, nobody's going to see the corrections from the tobacco industry. And in fact, they invented the white coat tactic of dressing some contrarian up in a white coat and pretending to be an expert voice, detracting from the mainstream scientific consensus. And so those tactics are often deployed, and that's just really problematic. And so I think that it's difficult to combat because we know that the brain is drawn much more to anecdotes and emotional stories than cold hard analytical facts. And so when you have two narratives that are presented to you, one is a consensus and one is an anecdote, people often relate more to the anecdote, which totally undermines this idea. And people don't have 1,000 independent scientists in their head counting as 1,000 voices. It's counting as just one voice.
One voice, yeah.
That's psychologically, that's very difficult to deal with. And then that's why we recommend the power of communicating expert consensus, because the more that's known and the more people know about that, the less likely it is that these attempts to cast doubt are going to be successful. But it's difficult. We have some work with the British Medical Journal where we're going to talk about to what extent should doctors be advocates for, let's say, vaccination or medical decisions? And should only immunologists or pediatricians talk to families about vaccines, or could it be any doctor? And it's tricky. Who should relay the consensus? And it's going to be, I think, an interesting discussion because I think it is important that the most trusted expert are doctors by far. And we want to preserve that. But they're also who is going to talk to people about what the consensus is on a certain decision? I've had some people, some doctors say, well, I don't know, it's up to people. I'm not going to tell people what decisions they need to make. Why would I randomly start talking about vaccines? Where some doctors say, hey, when I have patients coming in for something unrelated, I'm going to tell them about the consensus that vaccines are safe. And so I'm not sure what your thoughts on that. I guess different podcast, but it's an interesting discussion.
And some of the worst bad actors in the COVID arena have been doctors using their authority figure position to promote bad ideas that don't represent the consensus. But we will leave that for another day. So you have some great games that are available online that are designed to sort of immunize people against a lot of these tactics. And we're not going to have time to get into those, but I promise you that I'm going to put links to what's the name of the website? Inoculate Science? Is that?
Inoculate.science. You don't have to have the www, but inoculate.science. And people can find all of the games and videos on that website that in kind of a lighthearted and fun way try to inoculate people against these strategies.
But before we close, could you talk just a little bit about the things that we can do as individuals, and especially distinguishing between pre-bunking, debunking, and forewarning, and the pros and cons, and end with just a What's the right way to talk to people as opposed to the way that doesn't work?
Yeah, so one of the things that I end on in the book is the idea that really anyone can inoculate, and that it should be a tool for people. It's not necessarily Google or the government. There isn't the right institute or authority to be doing this. I think ultimately it's a tool to empower people and each other to make sure that we can alert each other to future falsehoods and help inoculate ourselves and our communities to build up this idea of herd immunity. And I talk about different ways that you can inoculate. And one is the what we call the issue-based or the fact-based inoculation, which literally creates a weakened dose out of the falsehood and then refutes it in advance and forewarns people. And so the two components of the inoculation are the forewarning, which is meant to jumpstart the psychological immune system because people are generally not paying attention. But if you tell them that there's actors out there trying to manipulate their opinion, when we perceive manipulative intent, all of a sudden that puts us in a heightened state of awareness. And so that's the important part of the starting point of the conversation. And then the pre-bunk or the weakened dose could either be, a weakened dose of an actual falsehood. For example, it could be that you say, oh, and there's people who try to tell you that COVID vaccines aren't safe. However, and then you preemptively refute it. Or there's the technique-based pre-bunk, which is more suited for situations where you think people aren't going to be receptive to any facts. And that's circumventing this problem of having to deal with facts, which is to level up to the technique level. And so this involves talking more about the techniques of manipulation rather than specific issues. So, for example, you might say, look, there's this technique called impersonation. People use it to prop up fake experts. So, for example, often people, let's say with a PhD in education, call themselves doctors, and then we'll talk about the COVID vaccine, but actually they have no expertise in medicine, and that's called a fake expert. Or you don't even have to use COVID. It could be a totally non political example. People can get on board with this idea in general that there's fake experts and how they work and how they do people, or that there's conspiracy theories in general. And then hopefully, when they turn to specific issues, that's going to be in the back of their minds and helping them spot and neutralize it. It's a bit more of an indirect approach. So you're going to have to be comfortable with the fact that you help people spot these techniques, but they might not fully immediately change their mind. It's a process that unfolds over time. And so, surrounding this idea of pre bunking, whether it's the issue or the technique, and whether it's passive or active. So, really quickly, passive means that you give people the counter arguments or the tools they need to dismantle a falsehood in advance, and people are the receptacle and they just receive it. Or you can do it in an active way, which is what we try to do with our games and interventions, is that you help people generate their own antibodies, which can be more effective because it's more motivating for people and they have more agency over their own thought processes. So you might quiz people and say, okay, if I present you with this conspiracy, how would you respond? Could you think of any counter arguments? And when people come up with that stuff on their own, it's going to stick better. And so that's what we call active inoculation. So those are the options that people can take in everyday conversations. And then surrounding that, I think there are some tips that are probably useful. When you try to debunk something which happens if you come really after. And so I think the important thing is to use the conversation to identify what I call the incubation period and the infection status. Just as with some viruses, it can take a long time for people to become infected. And so even if people have been exposed but not yet fully convinced, inoculation could still work. So you first have to figure out in what stage of the process is this person. So am I talking to someone who's on the fence or just been exposed? You can probably still inoculate them. If you're talking to someone who seems utterly convinced of a falsehood, then you probably know that this is going to be more of a debunking type of conversation. And then you want to use the best evidence we have on how to debunk, for example, using the truth sandwich rather than repeating the misinformation a lot. And so that's one tip. And then the last thing I'll say is you want to do all of this in a way that's non-confrontational. I think the worst thing, and I see this in my family all the time, it's people are too direct. You approach and you say, you're wrong, you're stupid, you believe misinformation, you have it all wrong. People will just retreat and become defensive. And so it's not going to work. You need a gateway to having people open up, and then you can either debunk or pre-bunk or whatever tool you're going to use. And that gateway could be many things. One could be to try to show some empathy for people's situation and say, look, I know pandemic's been rough on people. People have lost their jobs. We're all angry about something, but that's not necessarily a reason to, and so on. Or you could use what we call worldview validation, which a lot of people are not comfortable with, but we know that that works sometimes, is to say you validate people's worldview before you say something potentially threatening. So you might say, look, some conspiracies are real, right? Julius Caesar, the Romans, they plotted against him. So I'm not saying that's a crazy idea. What I am saying is that this particular conspiracy isn't real and so on. And so then people feel you're taking them seriously because you're validating part of their worldview, but you can still have a discussion about whether this conspiracy you're talking about is real or not. And the approach I take is often more indirect. I let people come to terms with things. I don't push them. If we agree that there's manipulation tactics that might be deployed, if they entertain the idea that other people might be duping them and that's why they have these beliefs, then I stop and call that a success. And then you have another conversation and another one. And I think people sometimes forget with a lot of this stuff, people don't just join cults overnight. They employ a radicalization process that's very lengthy. So I think in a similar way, if you're trying to undo the damage after the fact, you have to come to terms with the fact that it's going to require repeated engagement, low pressure, and you need that gateway to have a positive conversation and then keep that going over time. And part of it is also the social support network. If people are surrounded by other people that don't have alternative points of view, then they're not going to shift their beliefs because that's not being reinforced in the network. So thinking about how you can change the structural conditions and put people in different environments. That's often what they do with radicalized people, right? They also give them a new support system, other people they can go to. Not saying that you always talk to people who are in a cult, but a lot of the QAnon conspiracy stuff operates in a similar way. So that's some approaches that maybe people can take.
What else would you like to share before we close?
I think ultimately the only way to reach herd immunity, which is the idea really that if enough people are psychologically inoculated in the population so that some of these techniques no longer have any effect. I think that's only going to happen if this idea spreads interpersonally. So I think people underestimate their own role in the process of pre-bunking and information resilience. I think we all have the ability to help each other and we don't just have to leave it to fact checkers. That's my message, that everyone can play an active role in helping each other spot manipulative information.
Do you have any advice for students who might want to learn more about inoculation science?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say they can read the research papers. I mean, if they're research students, there's a lot of research papers on it, a lot of review articles and meta analyses. If people want to learn how it works in practice, they can play some of the games or watch some of the videos or become involved in larger research initiatives that are ongoing. And of course, people can also have a look at the book if they're interested. But I think mostly, if people want to learn more about inoculation science, make it a topic of your dissertation or your paper. And I think that's a great way to engage with the content, try to see what it's about, and maybe even experiment a little yourself with some of these approaches.
Before I get into today's review, I want to mention that you will find complete show notes and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com. Please send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. I also want to mention that the Brain Science mobile app is now called Brain Science Podcast. This app is available for all mobile devices and is a great way to access both free and premium content. To make sure you never miss an episode of Brain Science, please be sure to sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter so that you can get show notes automatically each month. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. You'll get a free gift entitled 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. I want to thank everyone who supports my work financially or by sharing it with others. I have actually created a table to help you decide whether My Lips and Premium or Patreon is best for you. Patreon supporters who pledge at least $10 per month get transcripts, ad-free episodes, and a copy of my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. If you are already a $10 supporter and you didn't get your copy, be sure to let me know. The good news in Xander van der Linden's book, Foolproof, Why Misinformation Infects Our Minds and how to build immunity is that there really is something we can do about the problem, even though the techniques being used seem to be becoming more and more sophisticated. The key principle is to build our awareness and our ability to recognize manipulative techniques. Studying conspiracies is a good place to start because this is where the principles are more easily recognized. He uses the letters conspire, C-O-N-S-P-I-R-E, as a mnemonic. The first C is for contradictory thinking, O for overriding suspicion, N for nefarious intent, S for something must be wrong, P for persecuted victim, I for immunity to evidence, and R for reinterpreting randomness. Those who embrace conspiracy theories tend to have similar psychological traits and often believe in multiple contradictory theories. I never used to take conspiracy theories seriously since it doesn't really matter if someone believes the moon landing was a hoax. However, if they refuse to be vaccinated, despite the scientific evidence that vaccines are the best way to prevent serious infectious diseases, this can cost the lives of others. As a physician, I feel compelled to say that vaccines are the most important discovery in medical history. When somebody decides not to be vaccinated, their choice affects those around them, not just because herd immunity requires a high level of vaccination, but because there will always be those who can't be vaccinated or whose immune systems are too weak to respond properly. This is an issue of science and public health, not politics. Given the role that conspiracy theories have played in vaccine hesitancy, I wanted to have a better understanding of how they work. Dr. van der Linden mentions the games his groups have developed. One of those games tasks the player with creating and spreading a conspiracy theory. In the book, he describes this game and how it appears to generate at least a partial immunity against the conspire tactics. Next, he moved to the basic techniques that are used to spread misinformation in general. In contrast to facts backed by evidence, misinformation is easily spread by being more novel, using moral language, using emotional language, being more provocative. A person might spread something because they say, oh, this would be interesting if it was true. Other techniques include false dichotomies, scapegoating, using emotions to polarize, and fake experts. He gave some examples of all these things in the interview. Now, I just gave you a relatively boring list that you are probably not going to remember. Therefore, I suggest that you go to the website Inoculation Science, where there are videos and 3 different games to try out. I would love to hear your comments and feedback. Please send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com and visit brainsciencepodcast.com for additional episodes and transcripts. As I record these words, I'm still waiting for my visa, but hopefully by the time you hear this episode, I will have completed my big move to New Zealand. I would love to hear from those of you in Australia and New Zealand. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again soon. Brain Science is copyrighted to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy this episode to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mindfire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.